So as I entered the building this morning, I worked with the King's Fund in what is now known as the good old days to many of us. And one of my favorite moments was when I was sitting in circle with the staff at the King's Fund. So this is like 1996 or so. And there were a number of colleagues in this circle who are now good friends of mine. And so we're talking about change and leadership. And finally, one of my friends interrupted. She said, "You know, Meg, I can tell you're an American because you think we want to change." And I am half English, so I've worked here quite a bit and lived here some. So I want to tell you a little bit about my own trajectory of my work, which is that having been graced with working with some extraordinary leaders over the years and still supporting a few, I came to realize how increasingly difficult it is to be a good leader, because there are pressures from the environment, from the culture, which I will detail to you in very grim detail this morning. But there are pressures coming upon leaders over which leaders have very little control until they decide to exert control. So I have gone from believing that large-scale systems change is possible if we just change our thinking, if we start to think systemically and we start to think more organically and non-mechanistically. That's the early part of my work. But now I'm really, as you will see, I'm feeling very strongly that what we have to do is use our own power and influence as best we can to create what I call islands of sanity. This is a time of increasing irrational behavior, not founded on evidence or logic or what's best. It's a highly distracted and politicized environment. I do not intend to cheer you up, but what I do intend with all my heart is to help you become effective leaders within your own domain. Wherever you're working, wherever you aspire to be working, how can you take control of the circumstances that at this point are fairly out of control, and really be effective? And I don't think that's just from learning good leadership skills. I think that part's real easy compared to how we have to deal with the current pressures and insanities of this time. So there will be a method to my madness of where I lead you, but the outcome is I hope you will feel strengthened, more courageous, and clearer about the kind of leadership you want to exert for this particularly difficult time. I've also worked quite a lot with the NHS, and every time I come over, which is a few times a year actually, they're going through another reorganization, right? How many of you are with the NHS? Okay, so that's how it is. So this is the question, and I want to start by getting a sense of your own experience with some of these times and dilemmas. So we're going to start with a conversation amongst all of us. If you would take a few minutes, please, and describe an issue or problem that you're dealing with that is a systems issue. Simply, it's not something you have any control over, but it does directly impact your work. And it's meant to show you that we are dealing with pressures, dynamics beyond our control. Okay. So one, I will talk about each of these. One is time compression. One is the growing bureaucratic systems. I mean, some of you gave examples of, you know, you're all put together and you're supposed to solve problems you never could, or you're supposed to work in new ways together at a time when you're all scrambling for funds with very unhappy workforce. And this question of disconnect from my values, I was thinking as you were speaking that in the United States now, we have a statistic that 60% of our doctors want to leave the profession. 60%. And those are the ones who are already out the door. And then those coming up are, you know, people who go into teaching in the States don't last more than a year these days. Because, so we have this extremism, as I said, that I think in part is caused by these dynamics. The third one is unending budget cuts. You are only beginning the austerity measures. It's 15% now. It's going to be, that won't work. So this whole mindset of cut, 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 again, is global. And then we're very distracted. So I will go through each of these and make my case. So the first is time compression. My best evidence for people's unwillingness to spend time in thinking are these books that I've seen. I saw these for sale in the US. I also saw them in Edinburgh recently. So I'm interested in science, so I looked at this one. I refused to buy it, you know. But it told me that in 30 seconds I would learn about Schrodinger's cat, I'd learn about theory of relativity, I'd learn about the structure of the human brain in 30 seconds each. And I did some quick calculation that if I read, and there were more of these books, I could get a really great liberal arts education in about a day and a half, you know. So that's part of it. And what this is doing to the workforce, this was from 2010, and I'm sure it's gotten even worse, but at that time people were reporting they were working 2 to 4 times as hard. Every time you have an austerity measure, the weight of the cutbacks fall on your staff, right? People are doing more and more and more. So they gave these very fancy terms. But basically, it says we're working people to death, you know. And what this is doing to our capacity as human beings, which I will go through later, is that we can only expect certain capacities when people are overworked, tired, exhausted, and under stress. We become robotic. We do what we always did. There's no time for thinking, for big picture, for collaboration, for systems thinking. No, it's, you know, the more tired we are, the less brains we have available. So I get invited to a number of places where people want to talk about innovation and creativity as if that's the problem. It's not the problem. If we were serious about this, we would start to slow things down, reinstitute thinking to the workplace. It's one of my big campaigns. Let's turn those brains back on that we've shut down because of so much pressure and stress. A lot of people are reacting this way. This is a British poster from the 1930s. Yes. We could make a fortune with t-shirts of this now. Yes. So that's the first thing. I mean, we've just taken this concept of time and felt that it's irrelevant. And that it's like putting a 15% budget cut in, or across the board 10% budget cut. Or what I see happening a lot is you are now asked to any solicitation of ideas, even though the ideas should be given some thought, one of the large systems I work in, a letter went out to everyone saying, we want your ideas for the next basically 5 years to celebrate the centennial that we're coming up to, and we need these in 24 hours. Why bother? You know, I think it's really insulting. And you may have also seen that training programs, well-developed learning programs, where people really delved deeply and took time and were able to really be thoughtful. I've seen these go from 3 days to 3 hours in many, many places. So time seems to be something that you can shrink without consequence. And that's my basic sense of time compression. So it's part of this complete ignorance of what it takes for human beings to do good work. And you'll hear this from me over and over again. The other great tragedy is we're in this era of bureaucratic systems just growing of their own their own momentum. And so it leads to increasing rules and regulations, and also a number of reports and measures. We don't have to go into this. You're living it, right? But I do hear from so many leaders where they say, I now spend more time writing reports about the work than doing the work, in some bizarre shift of means and ends. And over in Holland Park, where my cousins live, they have a nice little NHS clinic across the street from them. And one day I was walking down the street there, and there was a little handwritten sign in the window that said, we will now be closed on Thursday afternoon so that we can catch up with our paperwork. However, this will not diminish our service to you. You know, well, I don't know how it wouldn't, but we're just, especially in health, right? I mean, the amount of, it's one of the most controlled industries in the world, right? So my belief is that this view of human beings is what is behind all the proliferation of reports and bureaucratic measures. We simply don't treat people like people anymore. So I want to contrast this with this, because I think people are too difficult to think about, and this is so much easier. And now it's been like this for a long time, but it's growing now with an intensity where I think there is increasing distrust of staff and of service providers. And so we pass rules and regulations to contain bad behavior rather than thinking, how do we support creativity and innovation that is intrinsic to all human beings? So I recently got this off of an egg carton, and I want to make this the new Standard of Excellence Award for organizations. If we can do it for chickens, why can't we do it for people? That's my new campaign, I think. And then we have these mindless budget cuts. This is justice and liberty weeping outside of the U.S. Federal Capitol building. And this is a very true depiction of what's happening. But these mindless budget cuts are based on an ideology that if it looks good on a spreadsheet, it must be good. You know, numbers are the easiest thing to manipulate, right? 15% across the board cuts. We had this throughout the federal government last a year and a half ago, 10% across the board cuts. It's the stupidest possible way to manage finances, because some programs could take a 25% cut and others need every dollar or pound they have, right? So it's this kind of stupidity combined with a fair amount of political mean-spiritedness. And I think one of the explanations comes from this wonderful book. I would really recommend you read this, by William Ophuls, on immoderate greatness. It's about societies that are in decline. So we're addicted to our ruling ideas and their received way of life and fanatical in their defense. Instead of changing their minds, leaders redouble their efforts to do what no longer works, wooden-headedly persisting in error until the bitter end. And this is where we are right now. You know, something doesn't work. What do? We do it again using the same process, but faster. And then if it doesn't work, we do it again using the same process, but we fire the initial leader or team. Nobody's questioning the process, except we are as individuals. And this, I mean, I'm very touched by what you presented, because a lot of us are feeling this disconnect between why we went into the work, the field, and what's possible now. And this is where I'm hoping that we can create islands of sanity, that where we push back against these senseless values or these senseless ways of operating. And I'm hoping that's possible. I know of a number of leaders who are doing this, and I also know what it takes in terms of personal stamina and courage. So by the end of the day, I will be talking about perseverance. And in the middle, after I thoroughly depress you, we'll talk about islands of sanity and how you create them. But I would like you to stay in touch with your emotions during this, because this is a very difficult time to be a leader, period. And I admire all of you for coming today and for trying to get a handle on what would be more effective practice as a leader. Now, just to really seal the depressive moment here, one commentator has looked at us and called us future eaters. That none of these austerity measures or reorganizations are based on developing future capacity. In fact, I just think they're outright ruthless and blind, maybe, but ruthless in how they weaken the prospects of the people that you're trying to serve, right? And you would have run into this, yes? So the last issue we're dealing with here is distraction. And I think this is partly why our politicians and chiefs get away with so much, because we're just totally distracted. So here are some photos. I do believe, I think this was a date, but I do believe that the smartphone will go down in history as one of the most significant technologies to destroy society, because we now are only in our individual lives. And so public spaces are no longer public, they're just everyone's walking around like this. Has completely disrupted our relationships and changed them. So I think we'll look back in a few years and see that this was not the boon to society that we thought. And sometimes when I'm just walking down streets and I'm looking at this, I just think, some evil alien, all they have to do is send a signal through the smartphones and we'll all be subdued, right? Because that's just where we're looking. This is a community coffee house in New Orleans that I went to with friends. And we were really interested in having a conversation. We walked into this space, we thought, oh, it won't be here that we can talk out loud even. And then in airport terminal, this is the newest thing. You put this is in the States, you put an iPad on every table. So one, you're constantly entertained, and two, you order your food this way, and you don't have to worry about where you are. Again, it's just ultimate distraction. And then this is coming. Apple's new wristwatch, never offline. You can monitor everything about yourself, stay constantly connected. And this has led already to one city in China has put texting lanes. Like you have pedestrian lanes and bike lanes, they have a texting lane. So people can walk blindly down the street, and not get hit by cars. And the person who wrote this article said, pretty soon you're going to get text messages that you're about to bump into somebody. Anyway, it's incredibly disturbing, but it has led to this. And aren't we all here, right? This is me, for sure. The real issue with distraction, though, is, I'll talk about it in a moment, is what it does to our brains. I use this image to describe what I feel are the centrifugal forces at play. So in a centrifuge extractor, those of you in the medical field would know this, you take a solution where elements are combined and you want to separate them. And how do you separate them? By spinning them at very high speed. Well, voila, here we are, separated from one another by the speed of life and being so distracted. So I think it's a very apt image of what's going on, and we as leaders need to realize this and counteract this crazy spinning away from one another. And the reason we have to do this is because humans get through anything when we're together. This is the saddest and most tragic part right now. We are losing our human capacities, and our relationships are weakened at the very time when we need each other more and more. We can get through anything when we know we have neighbors, when we know we're together. And so that's why the separation is so terrifying, really. The isolation and the meaninglessness only increase in intensity because we're not in that strong fabric of relationships. So here's the Titanic. The Titanic was brought down by distraction, not just arrogance, needing to be the fastest, the best, the most luxurious ship of all time. But 3 days before they entered the ice-filled waters, the radio operator started receiving many messages from ships that were ahead. And they were all saying, there is a lot of ice ahead of you. And the captain probably didn't really understand the messages he was seeing. And so he didn't slow down because they were trying to break a speed record. He just slightly course corrected, but they charged on ahead. But the real telling moment was 40 minutes before they collided with the iceberg. The radio operator had received a message from a nearby ship, and the message was, we are surrounded by ice. And his response was, shut up, I'm busy. So it's a perfect metaphor for our time. I mean, how often do we feel that impulse to just say, I'm too busy now, I'll talk to you later? Or I notice how people describe their busyness. It used to be people would just say, I'm busy. Then they would say, I'm busy. Then they would say, I heard this on the streets here, oh, I'm busy. And then it's become, oh, I'm freaking busy, or I'm crazy busy. And I used to have staff come to my door and ask, do you have a minute? All right. And then I recently heard my son, who's in business, he's 34, call his business partner and say, do you have 5 seconds? And then they talk for 30 minutes, of course. But it's this shut up, I'm busy, this feeling of busyness that is ultimately so destructive. And what it destroys when we're under stress, when we're tired, and when we're distracted, this is what we lose. It's quite a compelling list for me. We lose memory. So you will note these days, you tell somebody something, doesn't matter their age, they just forget it, right? Especially staff in cafes is my current bugaboo. We don't have time to listen. Therefore, we don't really solve problems. These are physical disabilities that we create. I mean, we physiologically lose these capacities. It's not just that we're not a good listener. We actually lose the capacity for that. So, can't do strategic planning, can't expect innovation or big picture thinking. When people are under stress, we're in a very shallow part of the brain. Very shallow. And we lose all of these things. So you can't sit down in a staff meeting and ask people to envision a new way of working together or think strategically long term if they're stressed. And this is important. We lose the ability to make moral judgments. We just become very reactive. And therefore, of course, we lose patience and compassion and caring, all of that. So what we're creating in this current work-life environment is really a dehumanized version of ourselves. And I think this is the essential act of leaders, to reawaken people's human capacities. And the only way to do that is by creating, which we'll talk about later, creating time to think, slowing things down, and understanding that if we continue at this pace, this frequency, this intensity, we're going to end up as future eaters nowhere.